This is a production of Cornell University Library.
Thank you. So I'm Alan, the Dean of Human Ecology, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the speaker, Corinna, today. So one of the great benefits of being in a college with a size faculty of 100 or so is you really get to know the faculty members sort of one-on-one, and you get to experience and see their research up front and up close and personal. And so it's really been a delight to work with Corinna and see her work evolve. And you know, the provost has introduced these concepts of radical collaboration, and it's sort of, the dean said, do we like that word or not? But it's radical collaborations. And I think when I think about in the social sciences, the types of collaborations that Corinna has worked on, they really are radical in the sense of really bringing in multiple perspectives and disciplines to deal with some of the most pressing issues that we experience through the lifespan. And so Corinna's going to be focusing on aging and health and emotion, but she does this working with faculty, not only in human ecology, but her research more broadly works with faculty in the Medical College in New York, at Weill Medical, and people all around the university. So I want to congratulate you for that collaborative spirit. So I'll give you this, some of the nitty-gritty now on her. So her pedigree. So she's a professor in human development, and again is actually jointly appointed in the Medical College at Weill Cornell, and with a focus on gerontology. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Marburg in Germany and her PhD from Stanford University, which is an accredited institution as well. She completed her postdoc fellowship in the intramural research program of the National Institute of Aging before joining Cornell in 2009. It's hard to believe that was 7 years ago, my gosh. She was recognized, and this is great, so in the area of psychology, there's this group that identifies nationwide rising stars in psychology. And so Corinna was identified by this national group as a rising star, which I love that. And it's in, and also I could go on and on about all our connections with Gerontology Society of America and the different groups that she's associated with. Again, her collaboration with Weill is very aligned with the strategic plan of the university to bridge the gap between the Ithaca campus and the New York City campus. So to have faculty working at that intersection is really, it's like the perfect combination. So again, I want to introduce Corinna to the group, and she's a great asset to Cornell broadly and obviously to human ecology, and I'm proud to have her as a faculty member in the college.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much to everyone for being here today on this gray November afternoon. We will be talking about a recent book on emotion, aging, and health. And this book is, in fact, it stems out of a conference that was held in 2013 here at Cornell University that was entitled New Developments in Emotion, Aging, and Health. And it was co-organized with my colleague, Anthony Ong. Here he is. He can't be here today because he's doing a case study in early childhood development. So he just welcomed a new member to his family, so he can't make it today. But he's here in spirit, I'm sure. So as we called out this conference, what we were asking ourselves is, how can we bring more connections between two lines of research that have gained more and more prominence over the past couple of decades? One line of research looks at age differences in emotion, motivation, and self-regulation, and examines how these aspects of functioning change across the lifespan. And then on the other hand, there was increasing evidence for an influence of psychosocial factors in physical health, So to some extent, how does people's emotional health earlier in life, how do their stress levels, how does their exposure to discrimination and other factors, how does it affect their physical aging, including, to some extent, indicators of aging at the cellular level. So what we were trying to do with our conference was to bring representatives from each of those areas together in order to have, in a sense, a mini think tank, giving them the opportunity to talk to each other and hopefully come up with new lines of research. Obviously, I can't repeat the full conference here, even though I would very much like to do it. But instead, what I would like to do is to talk a little bit about what some people have termed the paradox of aging, that there's a lot of problematic developments as we get older with regard to our physical abilities, some aspects of our cognitive functioning. But then at the same time, people appear to be fairly balanced, and they report high levels of well-being. And so what is going on here, and how can we explain this apparent paradox of declining and sometimes failing health and continued well-being in later life? So this is just one small component of what was covered in the book and the conference, but I think for the benefit of this talk, it helps to take a closer look at that. So when we study lifespan development, we are faced with a formidable task, right? Because we are not just assessing people, trying to assess people once and kind of get a snapshot of them at a given point in time, but we're asking ourselves, how does this little girl here turn into an adolescent and a young woman, and then finally into an old woman? And how does she's smiling in all these pictures? This, by the way, is my late mother-in-law. And she's smiling in all these pictures, so the positive emotionality, as we would call it as a psychologist, is consistent throughout the pictures. But how did this positive outlook on life influence her health in later life? And to some extent, how does her health influence her well-being? So this is the task that we're faced with when we're trying to understand health and emotions across the lifespan. Unfortunately, we are not left without a guide as we're trying to understand these things. One important thing we have to realize when we think about aging is that there's a common misconception that things just go downhill in a fairly steady pace with age, right? So this is kind of the layperson's view of aging. This is, in this case, it's cognitive aging, cognitive performance, but you could pretty much add anything else in there, and people's lay opinion of the aging process basically means that it's going downhill, right? But research in lifespan development has shown that, in fact, that this is not the case. It's not a realistic description. Instead, what seems to be happening is that we see some minor decrements in some aspects of functioning. Again, the example here is cognitive performance, but I could add anything else. And then what we see is relative stability until people reach a phase of terminal decline. Some people also call it terminal drop, but I think that's too dramatic because in some cases it's more steep than in other cases. So what we have to realize is that we really have to differentiate between a phase of healthy aging and then a period of decline before death. And that means that age by itself doesn't tell us much, because if we have somebody who is maybe 70 and they're going to die when they're close to 100, they are still at a level of stability. Whereas somebody who has the same age but is going to die relatively soon, they're already going to be in the downward trajectory. So chronological age doesn't tell us much anymore. Instead, we have to understand, we have to deal with variables such as closeness to death, and we also have to look more at a person's biological age, a person's functional age, what they can do, a person's social age, how they're embedded in their social context. And here's some recent data from a German study where they were trying to model, again, this relative stability with aging and then this phase of terminal decline. And it turns out that there's different transition points for different people, which in part may be due to the kind of disease that people eventually die of. So somebody who has Alzheimer's disease would have a longer decline than somebody who has some aggressive form of cancer, right? But one thing I want you to keep in mind throughout my talk is that really a lot of aging is surprising stability. It just doesn't seem to us like that, because sometimes we only start to think of a person as older once they're actually in this phase of terminal decline. And before that, they don't seem to age. They just seem to be in this permanent middle age, right? Also, what has been really influential in understanding age-related shifts in emotion is the lifespan perspective that was introduced by Margaret and Paul Baltus, who spent some time in the US and then returned to Germany to found the Max Planck Institute of Human Development in Berlin. And their perspective really takes a lifespan approach to understanding aging. So again, aging is not something that suddenly happens to you when you reach age 60 or age 55 or whenever the AARP starts to send you letters. But instead, it's something that happens consistently. And so in a sense, when we're living, we're aging, right? But at the same time, when we're aging, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're dying, right? So it's important to keep these aspects apart. Now, according to the lifespan perspective, if we want to understand lifespan development, how my mother-in-law turned from the adorable little girl to the smiling old woman, we need to keep some basic principles in mind. And the four core features of lifespan theory are multidirectionality, plasticity, contextuality, and multiple causation. So let's talk about multidirectionality first. So this captures the notion that development at all times goes into different directions. So some aspects of development may not be going so well, whereas other aspects of development are going uphill, right? And these do not happen separately from each other. They can happen at the same time, right? And there are inter-individual differences in patterns of development. So one person differs from the other, say, in terms of their cognitive aging. But there's also intra-individual differences. So the same person may be showing decline in some aspects and then stability or even growth in others. An extreme case that we could imagine would be Stephen Hawking. We could all agree that his physical development is nothing short of catastrophic, but at the same time his cognitive development, his intellectual development is extraordinary, right? And this is an extreme case, but in similar forms we see that in normal people, so to speak. And according to the Baltus team, this is a schematic, there's an understanding that when we go from birth to old age, there are always gains and losses present. And the relative proportion of gains to losses may shift with age. But even in very old age, there are still some gains present. Again, this counteracts this notion that everything just goes downhill with aging. So that's multidirectionality. Things can go in different directions at the same time, over time. Another important aspect is plasticity. So according to this principle, events or processes are potentially modifiable. They are modifiable at the neurobiological level, at the behavioral level, and at the societal level. And so the level of plasticity in these aspects determines how well we age and how we do physically and emotionally over time. So when we think about neurobiological plasticity, until 20 years ago, there was this erroneous belief that we were born with all the nerve cells we would ever have in our lifetime, and then the only thing we would do would be to lose them. And research first in animals and then in humans has shown that, in fact, neurogenesis, the creation of new nerve cells, happens throughout life. And in fact, you can actively enforce it by challenging yourself to do new things. And one famous example is the London cab drivers who are learning basically the whole map of the city by heart. They are actually actively increasing the hippocampus, and the better they do, the bigger the hippocampus gets. And then, of course, once you start creating new nerve cells, you can use them for other things. So that's the neurobiological plasticity. Also, at the behavioral level, there's plasticity. And so in one famous study, the Baltuses were asking people to come to the lab, younger people and older people, and they were asking them to do a word recall task. This was a difficult task, and so in the beginning, both older and younger adults didn't recall much. But then they were given training, they were given specific strategies, and it turns out that in the post-test, both groups increased significantly. And you can see the trained older adults are way above the untrained younger adults. And there's some overlap between younger and older adults, although overall, older adults on average didn't increase as much as younger adults. And you see also there's a higher variation here, which may be due to the fact that some of the older adults in that study, maybe they were already in this phase of terminal decline. Then there is societal plasticities. And so this is a question of what kind of opportunities does a given society provide for people of different ages. And so here you can see these three women. They are approximately the same age. But you can imagine that depending on the society that they're living in, they have different opportunities that are open for them. And one example for such age-graded opportunity structures would be the age at which one has to enter a university education. In the US, there's no clear deadline for this, but for example, in Germany, there is a maximum age that you can have in order to get student loans. There's also a maximum age that you can have in order to become a regular professor, right? And so depending on how much limitations there are, whether there's a mandatory retirement age, aging looks differently. Then there's contextuality. So there's this notion that in order to understand how we age, we cannot just stare at the individual, but we have to look at the context. And so here at Cornell, this model of development was promoted by Urie Bronfenbrenner. He was originally thinking about childhood development. He placed the child in the middle here, and I know that you can't see this in the back. I'll walk you through. He argued that children are part of microsystems that involve their schools, neighborhoods, peer groups, churches. There's an exosystem, which is the mass media, transit system, government agencies, a mesosystem, which connects different aspects of the microsystems, a macrosystem, which is dominant beliefs and ideologies, and finally, the chronosystem, which kind of moves this whole convoy through time. Right? So the realization that in order to understand how an individual ages, we have to understand the societal context in which they are embedded. And then finally, multiple causation. So this notion that there's not one factor that drives lifespan development, but there's always multiple factors, right? And often people kind of default to the assumption that with age, the biological part just breaks down, and then we're trying to manage that breakdown in some way. But that is not the case. According to this model of biopsychocultural co-constructionism, when we age, when we move through life, there are biological forces, there are psychological forces, there are sociocultural forces, and in combination, they form life cycle forces, which then, in turn, influence the person. All right, so what I hope to have done so far is to take you from this initial view of aging that's rather negative and kind of focused on downhill trajectories to something that understands that, again, if we're living, we're aging, but when we're aging, we're not dying. And that gives us a new perspective on how we can understand how this person moves from a little girl to an older adult. So when we talk about the interplay between health and emotions across the lifespan, again, keeping the lifespan perspective in mind, what we find is that there are some aspects where we actually do see some age-related decrements. So this is the marathon time, the world marathon records, and this is age in years, and you can see that this is the time people take, right? And so shorter is better, and you can see that people do best in about their 30s, and then times get higher and higher, but the very fact that we still have world record holders at 80 and beyond shows us that people retain their ability. It just takes them a little longer to get there. Nonetheless, we see some decrements here. Then we can look at aging and people's cognition, people's cognitive abilities. And so here, instead of seeing general decrements, what we see is a very interesting pattern where some aspects of cognitive ability seem to decline with age, whereas other aspects continue to improve. So what we have here, these are what we call fluid cognitive abilities. So that's the ability to quickly process new material and to put different stimuli in relationship to each other. And that actually declines with age. So people get slower and they get less accurate. At the same time, people's vocabulary, people's knowledge that they have accumulated over time, their knowledge base that they can draw from, in a sense our internal libraries, continue to increase into old age and remain stable. Right? So here we have some decline and some increases. And then finally, when we look at age and emotional experience, at first we think, oh, there's a downhill trajectory. But then we look at the label and we see its negative affect. Right? So people's negative emotional experiences are never as high as they are in people's teens and 20s. And when I show this to my students, they simply won't believe it. They just look at me and as if I'm crazy. Right? But the data don't lie, and this is one study, but there's many others like it that indicate that positive emotionality, positive emotions remain stable, whereas negative affect declines. So now the question is, why is this happening? So we have this multidirectionality where we have decrements in people's physical and sensory abilities. We have decrements in fluid cognition, including, to some extent, people's executive functioning, their ability to inhibit a response. And we have improvements in experience-based knowledge, and then clear improvements in people's emotions, how good they feel, people's life satisfaction. And so some have called that the paradox of aging, with the question, why, if people's health is failing and some of their marbles are rolling away, why are they feeling so good? And the answer is that as we get older, our ability to regulate our emotions and our ability to adjust to different kinds of situations increases. And there's several mechanisms that have been identified that may be driving this. So how do they do it? I will tell you. I tell you some aspects of it. One strategy is selective optimization with compensation. This is again from the husband and wife team, Baltus and Baltus. And so what they argue is that when people experience some decrements in their skills and abilities with age, what they do is they do selective optimization with compensation. They select specific personal goals and priorities that are particularly important for them. They optimize their functioning in that area of life to reach those goals. And then they compensate for age-related losses in other areas of life. So to give you a concrete example, this is again my wonderful mother-in-law. So she lived in France, and her family has this beautiful old mill that's sitting near a river, and it needs a lot of upkeep. In particular, it has a lot of garden areas. They're just all over the place, and they need to be maintained. And so initially, she loved to garden, and so throughout her middle age, she was happily tending to all the different terraces. But then at some point, she couldn't quite handle it all anymore, and so she decided she would optimize one aspect that was particularly important to her, and those were the roses. So she optimized the rose garden, and in order to do that, she read lots of books about roses, and she was training herself in order to do a better job tending for them. And so that was the aspect of optimization. But then, of course, there was a whole other part of the garden that still needed tending to, right? So you had to mow the lawn, and you had to cut those bushes and make sure that the deer didn't get whichever plants, right? And so she had to compensate in some form for that. And her approach to compensation was to simply get her grandchildren to help out with this, right? So my children are smiling here because they're not at the time they were too little to help out, but then a couple of years later, these are some grown grandkids that she had. And they were actually helping her to compensate and taking care of the rest of the garden. Right? And the same principle you can see in other areas of life. For example, people may decide that they are no longer interested in maintaining a large house. Instead, they're selling the house, they're moving in some kind of smaller apartment, and then they have all this extra time that they don't have to spend mowing the lawn and raking leaves, and that they instead can use to optimize, say, their ability to paint or to pick up a new hobby or to attend a book talk. So that's selective optimization with compensation. That's one explanation. Another explanation was proposed by two researchers called Schultz and Heckhausen. they focused on primary versus secondary control. And so what they argued is that human beings have a striving to control the world around them, and there's different ways of doing so. And the relative balance between those ways of controlling things shifts over the lifespan. Right? So there's primary control, and to give you this example, imagine you wake up one morning and you suddenly have this big elephant in your living room. I'm not sure whether you can imagine that feeling, but so you walk into especially on a day like today, but so you walk into the living room and there's the elephant, and there's two ways of dealing with this. On the one hand, you could engage in primary control and try to change the world around you, and this would involve calling the fire department and see how you can get this elephant out. Maybe you can cut a hole in the wall or something like this. So this would be primary control. Secondary control would be changing your attitude. And so an example would be to decide that the elephant is really a beautiful conversation piece for your next party, right? Maybe he can even serve drinks, and it also matches the decor nicely, right? So you can see that primary and secondary control are not always equivalent, right? Sometimes one is better than the other. But what research seems to indicate is that primary control dominates in early life, right? So here's the child trying to figure out how to build something out of marshmallows and pasta. And then, in fact, that's reflected in a lot of children's books. So if you've read the book Where the Wild Things Are, it's all about primary control, influencing the world around you. But then, a little bit later, right around the toddler years, when the terrible twos and the troublesome threes, children develop secondary control, which is the ability to regulate their internal states in order to come to terms with things in the external world that they can't change. Right? And so most goals in life have a limited time frame in which we can accomplish them. So for example, becoming a cheerleader, I think, is out of the question for me and for many people in this room. Becoming a parent is something that has a clear biological deadline for women, not so much for men. Climbing Mount Everest is another example where people are trying to push the developmental deadline here, but it gets difficult after a certain age. And the idea is that primary control is best when the goal is still attainable, but secondary control becomes more helpful when the deadline for the goal has passed. So for example, if I suddenly had the goal of wanting to become a cheerleader, it would be better to reappraise my internal states and change them so I find ways of achieving those underlying needs without actually becoming a cheerleader. Could instead stand in front of a crowd and talk about aging instead of jumping up and down. Right? And so the idea is that opportunities for new goals and roles open up across the lifespan. For example, the grandparenting role, leisure-related goals, and retirement. Late careers in sports are no longer an exception, right? So they keep opening up, but overall, as we get older, there are more doors closing than there are doors opening, right? The relative ratio of gains to losses shifts. And so then what happens is we have to select the appropriate control strategies. So for example, if you consider this, a 73-year-old woman collects her pension from the post office once a week, which means crossing a very busy road. However, she has recently started using a walking stick, and she finds crossing the road very difficult and frightening. Right? So here's an older adult who's faced with a problem, and I think we can all agree that even though it may be difficult, she should engage in primary control strategies. Those could involve finding an alternative way to cross the road, or finding a way to change the delivery of her retirement check. But she should really change the external world in some way so she still gets her retirement check. On the other hand, consider this problem. An older woman visits her son and daughter-in-law at the hospital to meet her newborn grandchild. However, the daughter-in-law is bossy and actually quite insulting in instructing her on how exactly to hold the baby. Right? So you can see here again, there's a goal conflict that this woman has, but we could probably agree that a primary control strategy that's trying to change the world and trying to convince the daughter-in-law that she really knows how to hold a baby is probably not going to lead to a positive outcome. So here, secondary control and changing the attitude and realizing that maybe just waiting 2 or 3 weeks, the daughter-in-law will be ready to hand over the baby anytime, would actually be more beneficial. And you may be familiar with the Serenity Prayer, which is a key part of the 10-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, but it applies also to some extent to aging. it says, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And to a large extent, what research seems to suggest that as people get older, they are better at knowing the difference. So they know when to engage in what kind of control. So we have two strategies, selective optimization with compensation, primary versus secondary control. Another way that people seem to maintain high well-being in later life is comparing themselves to others, right? So when we're trying to figure out how well we as a person are doing, we often look to how others around us are doing, how our peers are doing. And the way we compare ourselves to others has emotional implications. So when we are comparing ourselves in a contrast mode to other people who are doing worse than us, when we're saying, well, you know, I'm really doing way better than this person over here, that makes us feel good. We may also, sometimes we may look up to somebody and we say, wow, here's somebody who's doing amazingly well, but you know what? If I just put a little bit more effort, I can be that person, right? And both of these make us feel positive. On the other hand, sometimes we may be in a situation when we don't feel like we have a lot of control over our given standing on the dimension. We may look to somebody who's doing worse than us and we're wondering, is this going to be me in the future? Or sometimes we may be looking at someone who's doing better than we are and thinking, I could never do that. I just don't have the energy, the time, add whatever you want in there. So it turns out that there's some evidence that social comparison strategies change with age, right? And so all Cornell students are aware of what happens with your social comparison group if you move from being the valedictorian at your very small high school into the middle of the Shark Tank at Cornell, and suddenly everybody is like, you know, former big fish that are now swimming in a large pond and are feeling small. So that's a challenge that people have to overcome, and that also happens as we move further through the lifespan. And so we can wonder, who do older people pick as their comparison group? And it turns out research seems to suggest that often as people get older, they compare themselves with negative stereotypes of aging, right? This downward trajectory that I was describing earlier. When you compare yourself to that, and you're still in the stable phase of aging, you're doing pretty well, right? And so when people compare themselves to this, you know, lonely man who's in a wheelchair in this institutional setting, that makes them feel pretty good. And in fact, in one of my research studies, I was asking people to tell me how well they were doing health-wise. In the blue line, I was asking a group of people to just tell me how their health in general was, and so you see some decline here. But then when I asked them, how are you doing compared to other people your age? Then suddenly the line remains stable, right? So to some extent, people adjust their expectations as in response to the changing realities of aging. And so looking at others, and I once met a 95-year-old woman, and I asked her how she was doing compared to her age peers, and she was just chuckling and saying, you know, I'm not dead yet. Yeah? So at this point, we have three pretty good explanations for why older adults seem to be doing quite well emotionally, even though there's some challenges that they're facing. But all of these theories emphasize coping with age-related losses and decline. But there's one theory that actually argues that it's not so much loss that drives these changes, but it's our awareness of where we are in the lifespan. So this theory is called Socioemotional Selectivity theory, and it argues that when we're young, then we feel that our life is wide open. We have all this time left. And so in a situation like that, what we're trying to do is to optimize the future, to meet lots of new people, to get as much information as we can so we can perfectly plan our future. However, as we get older and our time gets more and more limited, as we feel we don't have as much time left to accomplish everything, we're more likely to optimize the present, to focus on regulating our emotions, and to enjoy our close relationships. And then research in support of this theory has, for example, has looked at different settings and found that these age differences in goal priorities are most important when there's a goal conflict, that you can't do everything. Then, in general, older people focus on their emotions, younger people try to plan their future. Also, these results are really not driven by age itself, but they are driven by age-related differences in people's time perspective. So if you shift the younger person's time perspective, they show very similar changes. So that means that age differences are not set in stone, but that they can shift around depending on what happens in a person's environment. And so for example, one way that people have studied this, they have looked at who people would like to hang out with. So imagine you have half an hour of free time with no pressing commitments. Who would you like to spend your time with? A new acquaintance with whom you seem to have much in common, a close friend or family member, or the author of a book you just read, right? And so you can, in your mind, figure out who you would like to spend your time with. So it turns out that on average, the close friend or family member, the person who is most likely to make you feel good, the person where you have a good understanding of how the conversation will go, how the interaction will go, where you know in advance what you can do to make things go well, that option is selected most frequently by older adults. But there can be other factors that shift time perspective. So for example, when younger people are asked to imagine a geographical move where they move somewhere else, then they suddenly look a little bit like an older person in their preferences. When older people are asked to imagine a medication that extends their life by 20 years, then they suddenly look like a younger person a little bit. So suddenly they want to meet the author of a book they have just read, or they want to make new acquaintances. Being a graduating senior, you may have seen this in some of your students, kind of puts the emphasis on just spending time with their close friends on campus, and they may not be as interested in lectures anymore. And similarly, facing a life-threatening illness at any age can really shift time horizons and put the emphasis on emotional well-being in the moment. And one study showed that when there was a handover of Hong Kong from the British protectorate to mainland China, and people were really seeing this as the end of the world as they knew it. And 1 year before the handover, there were typical age differences in the kinds of goals that people were pursuing. But then just before the handover, everybody preferred to be with close social partners. And then 1 year after the handover, age differences were back to normal. And similar results have since been found around the world in response to 9/11. So the events that happen to us can sometimes shift time horizons for a whole society. It turns out that pursuing different kinds of goals also leads older and younger people to see the world in different ways, right? So in a sense, they're less likely to see the holes in the cheese, and they're more likely to see the raisins or the chocolate chips in the cake. And this has been studied by showing people images. So they're looking at a screen, and they see some happy bunnies, and they see some very sad pictures of oil-crusted birds, and then they see some boring pictures, such as a file cabinet. For some reason, that's a neutral picture. It's not necessarily neutral to me, but according to the study, it is. And so then you just show them these pictures, and then afterwards you have a surprise memory test, and you say, tell me what you remember. Now, it turns out that younger people remember more emotional pictures, positive ones here in red, negative ones. They remember more emotional pictures than neutral pictures. But by midlife, they still remember less neutral pictures, but they remember more positive than negative ones, and then this difference becomes quite extreme in old age. And the interesting part is this only happens when you tell people just look at the pictures like you would on the TV screen. When you tell them, try to remember the pictures, then regardless of age, people can switch on their more effortful processing, right? And they can actually tell you equal numbers of positive and negative pictures. But as a default, it seems to be that older adults have learned to see the raisins in the cake and not so much the holes in the cheese. This has been known as the positivity effect, and this is one of my final slides where I actually show you. So this is an average younger adult, and this is an average older adult. They're looking at emotional pictures, and what you see here is this is activation when people see negative pictures as compared to neutral ones. This is activation when people see positive pictures as compared to neutral ones. And what turns out is that younger people switch on their brain for both positive and negative, but older adults literally do not activate their brains when they see negative pictures. Again, they can do it, but you have to specifically tell them to do it. As a default, they don't bother. So in summary, I hope to have told you a little bit about why we have this paradox of aging. You should now have a better understanding why this happens and how older people do it. They selectively optimize and compensate. They pick the goals that really matter to them. They make sure they meet those goals, they reach those goals, and then they compensate in other areas of life. They use primary control, changing the world around you, and secondary control, changing the way you think about the world, and they use them very flexibly. They know when to use which one. Whereas younger people have the tendency to just try primary control for everything, which often backfires. Then social comparison processes. It seems that as we get older, we tend to compare ourselves to others our own age, and to some extent here negative age stereotypes may be helpful because they give us something to look down upon and say, hey, I'm doing so much better. As I said, the 95-year-old who told me I'm not dead yet. And then finally, socioemotional selectivity theory, where we keep track of our time in life and our time in a given situation, and depending on that, we flexibly adjust our goals. And to some extent, we really put on rose-colored glasses that we can take off when we need to, but we wear them a lot of time. So you can now ask yourself, to what extent could you make these strategies work in your own life? I'm assuming a lot of you are already doing this. Right? And so maybe you can catch yourself over the next week using certain strategies and say, hey, oh, I just did some selective optimization with compensation right there. Maybe I can leverage that elsewhere. So before I take any questions you may have, I would like to thank the sponsors of our conference, the Bronfenbrenner Center, the Institute for the Social Sciences, a NIH grant for a scientific research network on decision neuroscience and aging, the Cornell University Department of Human Development, and then also alumni and the widow of Yuri Bronfenbrenner. And then I would also acknowledge the various help that we have received for this work. And then finally, I have good news because all the original conference videos are actually still available online. So it's not just that you can listen to me online again if you want to hear it again, but you can actually go and listen to the original talks that were part of the conference. They are much more technical than what I said today, but maybe you want to dive into some of the details and get a bigger picture of what was discussed back in 2013. Thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University Library.